All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining CAPManagement's spring webinar series on sustainable HOAs. Today, our topic is on environmental sustainability. We have two guest speakers for today's topic. Kayla Zacharias is a graduate student and sustainability consultant for CAPManagement, and Kayla is going to be presenting on topics of energy efficiency, waste management, and sourcing environmentally friendly building materials for HOAs. Following Kayla's presentation, Diana Denwood from Aurora Water is going to discuss best practices for addressing water use at the HOA level, as well as some tools and programs that Aurora Water has developed for their HOA customers. The presentations will run about 30 minutes, followed by a question and answer session immediately after. So if a question comes to mind during the presentations, please use the Ask a Question feature by clicking on the bubble with the question mark and simply type your question in and hit enter. And we will leave a few minutes at the end to respond to each of these. Also, under the Handouts tab, you will find a one-page PDF highlighting some of the key takeaways from today's presentations. So before we get started, I'd like to just give a brief introduction to the Sustainable HOA series. So my name is Chris Marion. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer for CAPManagement. When I started this position, my work was really focused mostly on typical sustainability projects, mostly analyzing water, energy consumption for HOA communities, and recommending best practices for conservation. But shortly after completing this first wave of projects, we found there was value in extending this concept of sustainability beyond just the environmental opportunities, but also looking at the financial and social aspects of a community as well. So you might know this concept as the triple bottom line. Kayla's going to go over this concept in a little bit more detail. But in order to really understand the potential of HOA communities in the context of sustainability, we found that the most useful first step is to change the conversation around HOAs. So CAPManagement, we're an established HOA management company of nearly 20 years. So we know firsthand that HOA management for HOA communities can be problematic from time to time. Volunteer board members are handed over a huge amount of responsibility, and their decisions really have a significant effect on the living experiences of all residents. And oftentimes these good intentions can be bogged down by the day-to-day challenges. If you're a board member or a HOA resident, you're probably familiar with parking problems, architectural reviews, problematic homeowners, special assessments. But we firmly believe that the HOA structure can be used to talk about other things like collective action, community building, environmental action, and healthy living. So we want to talk about ways to create sustainable communities that are financially resilient, environmentally responsible, and a great place to call your home at the end of the day. So I would encourage everyone listening to set aside some of these less fun aspects of HOAs that you might be familiar with, and instead think about how your community can be used as a tool to elevate the living experience at your neighborhood. So with that, I'd like to hand it off to Kayla. And in just a moment, Kayla, I will give you control of the presentation. So again, Kayla is a sustainability consultant and graduate student at CU Boulder, and she's working towards the completion of a program in sustainability planning and management. Kayla is part of a graduate student team working to create a guidebook for sustainability within the HOA industry. Kayla, it's all yours.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Chris. So I thought we'd just start off by talking about what sustainability means. I know sustainability has become kind of a buzzword, and the definition can be kind of vague sometimes. But the general accepted definition is meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So sustainability really looks to protect our natural environment, human and ecological health, while driving innovation and not compromising our way of life. And Chris touched on this earlier, but the triple bottom line approach concerns people, profit, and planet, and all of those aspects are relevant to the HOA industry. But today, we're going to focus on the environmental aspect of sustainability. So what sustainability will look like in your community can vary based on several different factors. These include the type of home that you live in, so whether you live in a single family home, a condo, or an apartment, where it's located, and environmental factors. So in Colorado, it's really dry. water stressed, and that changes the way that people and consumers need to go about their lifestyles to be sustainable, and also whether your community has shared spaces. So the low-hanging fruit in terms of increasing sustainability in your home are energy and water use, effective waste management, and sustainable building materials. So as for energy efficiency, more than a fifth of all energy consumed in the US is residential. This is also the sector that we have the most power to impact directly. Most energy in Colorado comes from coal and natural gas, but renewables are growing, although they only made up 25% of energy consumed in the state in 2019. And people who live in condos and apartments typically use much less energy than those who live in single-family homes, but there are still things that you can do in a single-family home to reduce your energy consumption. HOAs can help save energy in common areas by installing energy-efficient lighting or insulating windows and doors, but it's largely up to homeowners to decide how energy efficient their homes are. Many people are also motivated to change their behavior at home by the belief that their behavior can make a difference. So just knowing that reducing energy use reduces your greenhouse gas emissions and helps tackle the climate crisis can really help people in motivating them to change their behaviors at home. You also don't need to purchase new technology to reduce energy use. You can simply change your behavior and perform some tasks manually, such as turning off the lights when you don't need them or hang drying your clothes. And the highest potential for savings in terms of energy efficiency actually comes from turning down the heat in the winter and the AC in the summer. On the technology side, energy efficient appliances and smart thermostats can help reduce energy use also. So installing energy efficient windows and insulating your home can stop heat or cold air from escaping. Additionally, some utility providers, such as Xcel, have programs like the Home Energy Squad. And in that program, they will send a technician on home visits for a flat fee. Typically, it's $50. And they'll do a walkthrough of the home and provide quick fixes for energy efficiency, such as LED light bulbs, programmable thermostats, energy efficient shower heads, and weather stripping for external doors. The city of Westminster actually partnered with Xcel to provide discounted rates for residents. So that's potentially something that HOAs could do. And then they also have an upgraded version of the program for $150 that will provide a more rigorous assessment of the home and provide additional energy upgrades. And then moving into waste management. How much waste a community produces can make a big impact on its environmental footprint. Humans generally generate too much trash to be dealt with in a sustainable way. And the amount of waste generated affects the environment in a bunch of different ways. It contributes to the worsening climate crisis. It has a negative impact on wildlife and the natural environment, and it's detrimental to our very own public health. Waste that is not biodegradable and cannot be properly recycled is filling our oceans and landfills. Landfills also generate methane, which is a greenhouse gas that is 36 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So although humans are emitting a lot less of this gas, the global warming potential of it is much higher than carbon dioxide. And a majority of the methane that comes from landfills is generated by the decomposition of organic materials, primarily food waste. So most communities in Colorado recycle, but composting is still fairly new. The average American throws away 219 pounds of food annually, and more than 20% of food purchased is never eaten. So one possible solution to this is composting, and that can help us use food waste in a beneficial way. Composting recaptures nutrients in the earth, builds healthy soils, and sequesters carbon and lowers your carbon footprint. So what can you do? The number one thing is to buy less. The less we consume, the less we need to throw away. And that goes for food as well as all other kinds of goods. Especially when we're ordering things online, that stuff comes in a lot of packaging. And although cardboard is generally recyclable, a lot of the plastic filling in bags that clothes or other kind of goods come in is not. So the less we consume, the less trash that we're going to produce. Another big thing is knowing what is and isn't recyclable. Throwing away something that's not recyclable into the recycling can contaminate the entire load and render it unrecyclable. So I know EcoCycle and Boulder County both have some really good resources online to let consumers know what is recyclable and what isn't. And then composting can either be done in your own backyard or in the community compost bin. If your community doesn't have a compost bin, there are companies that offer curbside composting options. Scraps and Trash Gurus are a couple that offer this, and they'll basically pick up buckets of food waste left outside your door. This works especially well in dense communities like apartments and condo buildings, where they can just do a quick sweep through the whole apartment and pick up all the food waste. Then on to building materials. Building materials and construction debris can generate significant waste for an HOA, as a large portion of these materials are sent straight to the landfill. More than 560 million tons of construction debris was generated in the US in 2017. So that's a huge amount of material that's just sitting in the landfill, and that's probably never going to decompose. But in terms of what you can do, many materials can be salvaged or recycled, such as asphalt, concrete, metals, and wood. These materials are repurposed for other construction projects. And then when possible, hire contractors who source sustainable materials and negotiate to recover and recycle as many viable construction debris as possible to avoid the landfill. And so this is becoming a more popular topic in construction, and contractors are becoming more aware of this. So with a little bit of research, you should be able to find at least a few options for contractors who are trying to be more sustainable in their practices. And then we have a case study that was done in one of CAP's communities. Villas West is a community managed by CAP, and they recently replaced their roof with partially recycled roof shingles, which were made from rubber from waste tires and plastic bottles. So these roof shingles are more resistant to hail, wind, and fire and last longer than traditional tiles. The company that installed them is called Malarkey, and they estimate that they'll last approximately 25 to 30 years, whereas the previous roof at Villas West lasted only 5 years after suffering significant hail damage. But these roof replacement tiles provided several environmental benefits. CAP did some calculations and figured out that 130 tiles replaced equals about 9,000 plastic bottles recovered. These tiles also contain smog-reducing particles, and the amount that were put in place at Villas West equaled the smog-reducing capacity of about 52 trees. 240 cubic yards of waste was diverted through the project, and these tiles also reflect sunlight better than standard roofing tiles, which provides a cooling effect. So they'll keep the inside of the home cooler during the summer and reduce the amount of energy that you need to use to cool the home. So although the initial cost is a little bit higher than traditional roofing tiles, it will last longer as it's more weather resistant, and it provides several different environmental benefits. And with that, I'll hand it back to Chris.
Great, thanks, Kayla. So remember, if anyone has a question for Kayla, please type it into the question box and we'll be sure to get to that at the end. So next up, Diana Denwood will be discussing water conservation best practices for HOA communities. Diana is an active member of the water conservation community here in Colorado. She's a senior water conservation specialist with Aurora Water, and she also serves as co-chair of the nonprofit Colorado WaterWise, which is an organization that educates, promotes, and connects water conservation efforts across the state. So Diana, thanks for joining us, and it's all yours.
Thanks, Chris. That was a great intro. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. Okay. Hey, everybody. So I'm going to be talking about some really practical recommendations that are not only best management practices in the field, but also things that are tried and true in the Aurora community, things that we've learned by working with HOAs in various capacities over the last few years. So I'm going to be focusing on, like I said, outdoor best management practices. Oops, skipped one. So there are 4 overarching elements that we always recommend. And some of these may seem really obvious, but they can pose significant challenges for a lot of HOAs, whether you're very well managed or are struggling with management. So the first one is understanding the property. This seems like a no-brainer, but it can be a lot more difficult than we think. The second is proper scheduling of your irrigation system. The third is having efficient parts, and the fourth is providing that good management, which is all important. If you're not managing your system, then efficient parts sometimes don't really end up helping that much. So the first is understanding the property, and what I mean is if you are not getting, depending on how your management works, if you're not getting your water bills, I would make sure to ask for those. So an understanding what those look like and what your annual allocation is. The City of Aurora and Aurora Water, we provide annual allocations to our properties, and I'll show you an example of a bill and what an allocation looks like and how it's determined in a second. The second one is mapping your property, having multiple different kinds of irrigation and irrigation part location maps. And then finally is conducting an irrigation audit or assessment if you haven't done that in a while. So here's an example of an Aurora water bill. Sorry, it got a little bit distorted here. But you can see that there are a lot of different line items, lots of different charges. There's a fire protection line charge, and you may or may not have that depending on how old your HOA is. Stormwater components, sewer components, and then the actual potable water use. So these all have different charges, and depending on who your provider is, they're going to look different. So it's important to know how those, what those are and how they're determined. At Aurora Water, the sewer charge is based on a winter quarterly average that also happens in Denver. So it's based on January, February, March bills. And so what happens in January, if you have a leak in January that artificially inflates your water usage, that's going to affect you the rest of the year. So it's really important to know. Your allocation also determines how much you're paying. So at Aurora, an allocation is how much water you expect your HOA to use over the course of a year. And how that's determined for existing HOAs is to average the amount of water used the past 2 years. So in this case, this HOA example, we expect the annual allocation to be 2.4 million gallons. And we show their year-to-date usage and also how much they have remaining. Now, within your allocation, it's charged at a certain amount. In Aurora Water case, it's over $5. But if you go outside of your allocation and are using a lot more than you're expected to use, the price per 1,000 gallons gets bumped up. The rate gets bumped up. So it's really important for you to understand how you're doing within your allocation and to budget for it. Okay, so that's the water bill basics. Now let's move on to other things with understanding the property and mapping. So when I talk about mapping out your property, I'm talking about knowing where all the shutoff valves are to each building. Each building should have its own main water shutoff. Knowing where the backflows are. That's for when your irrigation system gets turned on or turned off, and that protects water quality. Knowing where your meters are, and also I've seen meters can be called lots of different things. So for Aurora Water, each account is associated with one meter, but on your irrigation plans, the meters can have a different number. Property managers, I've noticed, sometimes even have different numbers for their meters, so it can get really confusing. So knowing where your meters are and knowing what they're called both by your water provider and by your property, very important, linking those two. Knowing where your sprinkler controls are, sometimes we leave that in the hands of our irrigation folks, and that's okay, but you want to have a copy of that information as well. Knowing where your rain sensors are, that is critical. Knowing your irrigation zones, where they are. So it's basically for each of those controllers, how many zones are represented or are controlled by one of your sprinkler controllers, and where exactly that is, where the square footage is. That can be really confusing. Knowing if you have a looped irrigation system, that can be important when you're responding to any breaks or other water emergency situations, because they're handled a little bit different than traditional non-loop systems. Knowing what your sprinkler schedule is and having it up to date. I can't tell you how many times I've gone out to an HOA and they've given me a sprinkler schedule, and then when I look at the controller, it's completely different. And then finally, understanding your maintenance boundaries. There's confusion over sometimes where the boundaries between one HOA and another is, and especially over time when our HOAs split or combine, those boundaries change. So keeping up to date on those is very important. I also recommend doing an irrigation audit periodically. Now, Aurora Water, we do provide these for free, at least several hours of it we provide to an HOA, so sending out a couple people for 3 hours and getting as much done as we can. But not every provider or service area has that, so there are groups that you can hire to do an irrigation audit, and that's going to be a complete review of your system, turning on zones one by one, looking for inefficiencies, looking for breaks. They also should provide you with a zone map if you don't have one. Then they're also going to provide you with a personalized report with recommendations on how to improve your system. Okay, so moving on to number 2 in the recommendations is proper scheduling. This is really critical. You need to pay attention to the water restrictions in your municipality. Here in Aurora and like other places, you can only watering restrictions start in May and go through the end of September. You can only water up to 3 times a week, and you can't water between 10 and 6. And as you can see here, we've got recommendations for different kinds of systems. So for pop-ups, we have recommendations for minutes per day, rotor heads a different set, and rotary nozzles, which are arguably the most efficient, even a different set. And you can see how they change by month, because as we know, the temperature and the weather changes throughout the year. And so you should not, as we call it, set it and forget it. You don't want to just set your schedule for the same amount of minutes per zone in May and expect that to be keeping your grass healthy in July. You really do want to change that every time. The next section or major recommendation is having efficient parts. Rain sensors are critical, and not just having rain sensors, but making sure they're connected and working. You'd be surprised how many times I've seen rain sensors that they're just not working, or they're hanging in a weird spot, like they're under an eave of a building. It's not going to be able to sense rain there. So you want to make sure it's in an open area, it's connected to your controller, and it's working properly. Controllers with the seasonal adjust can be critical. It helps you do smarter programming. And there are also smart controllers now out there. They've been there for several years. Some providers do have rebates for these kinds of things. Aurora Water does, but smart controllers sense temperature, they sense evapotranspiration rates, they sense rainfall, precipitation, and they adjust the schedule accordingly. So they're a really good tool in your toolbox. And then I already mentioned these rotary style nozzles are the more efficient type of pop-up spray nozzle. And there are a bunch of other efficient parts. You want to make sure that you've got check valves in your sprinkler heads and things like that. That's going to help you find the water savings and also keep your landscape healthy. And then the final part is, of course, good management. So having people that are paying attention to what's happening in the landscape and what's happening with the irrigation system. So part of that is setting an efficiency goal, and that's knowing how much water your property is currently using and how much water is actually recommended for those various areas. I'll talk about how Aurora works with HOAs to do that in a second. The next thing is monthly maintenance. You want to make sure that someone, your irrigation contractor, hopefully is doing proper monthly maintenance checks. They're identifying problems, they're changing that controller schedule, as I mentioned. And then someone from your board or the property manager is regularly checking in with the landscaper and finding out what the problems are and what has changed, and comparing that to the allocation that we already mentioned. Make sure you're staying within that allocation. You want to make sure that you as a board member or property manager, you have access to all the controllers and you familiarize yourself with those controllers and how they work. Any issue should be addressed promptly. You're looking into new technologies like the smart controllers and seeing what might help you with your issues at your property. And that any changes or problems are being documented and communicated to the board, between the board and the landscape contractor. So let's talk about what an efficiency goal setting can look like, and how we do this in Aurora. At Aurora is we've got something that's called the Variance program. And this is a volunteer opt-in program for not just HOAs, but also large properties or commercial properties. The most important thing here is that we're providing a lot of, at least I think the most important thing in this program is that we're providing constant information every month to a designated person on the board or the landscape contractor. I always recommend that, again, everybody be in the loop. And so we can show what the actual versus the recommended water use that has been occurring over the watering months for the entire watering season. And so it's kind of like a report card. You can compare to how much water is being used and how much we would recommend. And then so we show it in graph and then we show it in table form. We use a baseline of 17.5 gallons per square foot per year to determine that recommended water use amount. And of course, that amount is adjusted according to precipitation and evapotranspiration that we're seeing based on 4 different weather stations in the city. The other cool thing about the Variance program, which usually is what entices people to join, is that it's called the Variance program because it allows the HOA to vary from that maximum 3 days per week for the entire system rule that we have during the watering months. So for systems that are really large, sometimes it's hard to irrigate all the different zones in 3 days during the limited time frame of before 10 a.m. and after 6 p.m. So this allows an HOA to vary from that rule, and you can water 7 days per week. That doesn't mean you can water all the time whenever you want and have your grass like growing like crazy. Each zone still is limited to just 3 days per week, but the system as a whole can run 7 days per week. Of course, as I mentioned, that usage is monitored through that graphed data that we send out, and those emails are sent to the contact or contacts we have on file. The requirements that we have for that program is that it has to be, no residential properties are allowed in it. It's only multifamily HOA or commercial or large property. And you have to have a minimum of 20,000 square feet because those are the folks that are spending lots of money on water and also are probably going to need that variability in how much their system can run. Okay, moving along. The final recommendation that I want to mention is communication. I can't stress this enough. I've mentioned already how we like to keep the HOA board, property manager, and the irrigation or landscape contractor in the loop together. That is critical, but we do recommend that you appoint one board member to do primary communications. So that's the person that's going to get the reports first, along with the property manager, and then to disseminate that information out to the rest of the board or even to residents, depending on the situation. And another thing that we highly recommend as the best practice is to have a break action plan. So if there is a major irrigation break or even a minor one, what do? Sometimes in our experience, an HOA doesn't know they've had a break until someone like me reaches out to them or someone's driving by and files a water wasting report. So that's not ideal. It's ideal for you to know what's happening in your system before Aurora Water does. So with this action plan, it relies on both the board, the property manager, and also residents of that community to know first what to do. What is the very first step if you see a sprinkler head that's popped off and you see like a water gushing into the air? So you need to figure out who that primary contact is first. It's most likely going to be the irrigation controller so they can come out and fix it. Actually, excuse me, let me back up. It will be the board member that's doing the primary communications, because you don't want all the residents calling the landscaper. So the resident would call that primary board member, and the board member would make that initial call to the irrigation contract. And then somebody will need to immediately access the backflow prevention device to shut off the water. That doesn't shut off the water to a building, it just shuts off the water to that irrigation section. Obviously, the repair needs to happen next, and then a testing of the system. So those are our 4 main recommendations for that action and communication plan. So that's all I had for you today, but I welcome your questions. And with that, I will turn it back to Chris. Thanks so much for your attention.
Awesome, thanks, Diana. Yeah, I would just echo, from the management perspective, to the big issues that we see always is a lack of working knowledge of the irrigation systems. Since board membership changes, and a lot of that institutionalized knowledge can be lost in those transitions too. So having some physical documentation of the irrigation systems is really important, so that your current and future board members can be set up for success. And then the other piece is just, again, the communication and having clear expectations on who's talking to who has been just really useful in addressing water. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up our questions here. So I've got a couple for Diana. This is about the Variance program. So how should an HOA go about applying to the Variance program? Is it too late to apply for this summer?
Great question. No, it is not too late. So with the Variance program, you do need to apply every year. If you have, I'm assuming you haven't applied previously, and that's fine. The main contact, his name is Adam Waters. And will we be able to email folks, Chris?
Yes, we can.
So I can email you Adam's information, and he can get you all set up. It's a pretty simple application process. And then you would be receiving those monthly communications from Adam.
Perfect. We've got another actually we got a few water conservation questions. One person asks, we're looking into hiring a new landscaper either this season or next. What questions would you recommend we ask to make sure they're managing our system correctly during the bid process? Are there any professional certifications to look out for?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question, and I'll do my best. I haven't actually been asked this question before, so just a few ideas. First of all, if you have an irrigation contractor, you were asking about certifications, going through the ALCC, that's the Associated Landscape Contractors of Colorado, I believe is the acronym. They provide education and probably certifications. Another one I would also look out for is, it's not IA. There are several irrigation associations. I believe it's IA, it's the Irrigation Association, though I can double check on that. And they have really good certification programs. I've gone through a basic one. I didn't actually get certified, but I took the class, and it was really, really helpful. One question that I would ask an irrigation contractor that I was interviewing is how they balance making the landscape healthy while being conscientious about water use and water conservation, because that's the primary tug of war, right? So typically what you see with irrigation contractors are that you're paying them to keep your landscape alive. And one of the easier ways to do that is to err on the side of more water. So they're doing that because they're not paying the water bill. You guys are paying the water bill. So I think bringing up that balance, which is difficult to achieve, even really good companies still struggle with this because they're coming into your property. Who knows how old the irrigation system is? Who knows how well it was originally designed? And who knows if when it was actually constructed, they actually followed the the design. You know, there's so many factors. So, so I would say, you know, pose that question. How are you going to keep our landscape looking good while knowing that we don't have all the money in the world to pay our water bills? I would also find out if you don't have an irrigation audit report from the last few years, find out how they will, if they'll do that and how they're going to do it. You want to make sure that they're hitting all the components I mentioned, that they're mapping things out for you and they're sharing information with you. I'd also ask them about having a break action plan, like I mentioned, what they recommend, how they're going to address issues promptly. So those are a few questions that come to mind. There are probably more out there, but that should get you started.
Thanks, Erna. Yeah, those are, I definitely support those recommendations. The only other thing that I would add on the certifications is there's a fairly new program called the Qualified Water Efficient Landscaper. The acronym is QUEL, and that's been taking off in Colorado. So that might be something to keep a lookout for. I know there's several contractors that have gone through that certification as well. But just again, to Diana's point, the landscape management it's not just water. There's a lot of other factors, including property values and aesthetics and the upkeep of the system. So there's really a lot to consider when you're looking at hiring a new landscape contractor. And so yeah, I would definitely recommend taking your time as a board on figuring out who that is and who the right person is for the property. Let's see, we've got another question for Kayla. This person says, we don't have composting or recycling in our community. I'm not an HOA board member, but do you have any advice on what I can do?
Yeah, I would say go to the HOA board and they can either work with the HOA management company or look at it themselves. But either the HOA board or the management company can talk to local waste or composting providers and see if they can get a contract worked out. I think hearing from the community that, or from residents that they're concerned about that and that they're interested will definitely help get the ball rolling.
Yeah, and I would agree. I said, if you're wanting recycling and composting in your community, you're probably not the only one. So try to find, a few other residents or some allies that can kind of support an initiative. Then when you go to the HOA board, it looks a lot more attractive. And, at the end of the day, the board members are, supposed to be serving the interests of the community at large. So I think you'd have a pretty good argument if you were, speaking on behalf of other residents as well. And here's another one, just kind of generally on HOA sustainability. It says, how can we change HOA rules that inhibit sustainability? Kayla, do you have any thoughts on that?
I would say this is kind of similar to the last thing, but just if you're a resident, if you're not on the board, go to the board and, like Chris said, find some allies so they know that you're not the only person who's feeling this way. But the board is definitely there to assist residents and to help them. And the board is really going to know the path forward in terms of changing the rules that are governing the community.
Can I add to that, Chris?
Yes, please.
So I would also say that you may have to change your bylaws, and Chris, you can confirm or deny that, but that can be a large process, and I believe it often requires a lawyer. And so what I'd recommend is don't come out empty-handed to a board meeting to bring it up. There are probably model bylaws and HOA rules and regulations that have been created, before you. You don't want to recreate the wheel. So I would do a search and talk to other HOAs who have implemented practices that you're interested in, find out how they do it, and find out what language and what documents they used to get those going.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. If it's a common sustainability initiative, such as solar panels come to mind, there has been a lot of work done on what an appropriate resolution looks like from a legal standpoint to make an amendment to the architectural review of the community. That can be changed relatively easily. If it's something that's deeper in the bylaws or governing documents of the HOA, there's going to be a few other legal hurdles to get through. So it really just depends on what the initiative is and what change you're willing to make. Some changes can be made at the HOA level through a resolution or an amendment, so it doesn't require a complete revamp or review of the bylaws, which can be costly to have that reviewed by your legal counsel. So let's see, we've got just a few minutes left. And got one more water conservation question, Diana. This one's just in general. What advice would you offer an HOA that hasn't really considered water conservation before? What would be the best first step for us?
That's a good question. I would say your first step is to gather information. You need to figure out what your water use is and where it's happening before you can make any logical efficiency goals. So I would definitely start there. You know, talk to your property manager. If you're not getting your water bills, get a hold of them, reach out to your water provider, see if they have any assistance. Can they do any water use analyses for you? And that it would be the best place to start. So once you start there, and once you know, okay, we seem to be using more water indoors than we need to, or we seem to be using more water outdoors, you know, you can kind of split it into indoor projects and outdoor projects. Obviously, indoor is more difficult because those are privately owned spaces, but maybe you have a clubhouse or some shared space where there's water use that you can look at. Changing out old toilets. Toilets are the best place to start, hands down, for indoor water use. And then outdoors, you want the cheapest thing to do outdoors is to get that assessment done, like I said, and then fix the efficiency problems that don't require replacements. So if you have tilted nozzles, or if you have like breaks, obviously a break is, you want to fix a break first. Check your drip system. Breaks in the drip system can be secretive, it's not always obvious. So those are the places I would start.
Wonderful. Great. Well, thank you to everyone who asked questions. If anything else comes to mind, please get in touch. Here are a few other ways that we put together for us to all stay connected. So first, CAPManagement, we've developed a 10-minute quiz that gives you just a little scorecard on your sustainability efforts in your HOA, and you can find that by visiting CAPManagement.com and clicking the quiz. Secondly, we've also started a LinkedIn group called the Sustainable HOA Network, where we share case studies, best practices, other news related to this topic and events like this. So that's a good way to kind of stay connected with the larger network here in Colorado. And lastly, if you're interested in sort of a deeper dive into this topic, I'll be co-presenting at the Community Association Institute conference this fall on November 12th. I'll be co-presenting with Don Ireland, who is a water conservation activist and HOA board president of a large HOA here in Denver. If you're a property manager, you also get continuing education credits for that class in the fall. And lastly, I'd just like to remind everyone that this is part 2 of a 3-part series. So we'll be picking up next week on Wednesday, May 20th at 11 to talk about community sustainability for HOAs. So that's the 3rd and final pillar. And that's how to encourage meaningful participation and build community in your neighborhood. So thanks again for joining us today. Big thanks to Diana of Aurora Water and Kayla again for your presentations. We hope to see you all next week. Thanks, bye-bye.